Welcome to Real Therapy Gone Wrong, where film real meets real. We are Lyndsey Murray and Brandie Sellers, two sex therapists who point out the difference between Hollywood therapy and real life therapy. This show does not constitute a therapeutic relationship. Today, we're doing our first movie. We're doing Prince of Tides, which can be viewed on Apple TV or Prime Video. Lyndsey is going to recap the movie, and we'll chime in as we go to comment on the therapy and other mental health issues that come up. Take it away, Lyndsey.
Great. Yeah, this is our first movie. And so, as I am summarizing the movie for all of our listeners, there may be parts of the movie that I kind of skip over just for the sake of time because this is a 2-hour movie. But we will include like all the important parts and definitely the parts that we want to talk about. And so, I'm going to do kind of a quick, like, couple sentence summary of the movie and then we'll get into the detail and then Brandie obviously stop me at any time when something like, really piques your interest that you want to talk about. So, overall summary of Prince of Tides. The protagonist of the movie is a man named Tom Wingo, who's played by Nick Nolte. And this movie revolves around his family background. His sister Savannah, played by Melinda Dillon, who has attempted suicide, and Savannah's psychiatrist named Dr. Susan Lowenstein, who's played by Barbra Streisand. And in this movie, over time, we really get to see this interesting relationship that Tom and Dr. Lowenstein grow to have. I also want to give a trigger warning that there is a rape scene in the movie, which we will be referencing. So, the beginning of the movie, it kind of shows like Tom and his siblings as kids. And really, the gist of the opening scene is to show that, when he was a boy, he kind of thought his mother was amazing and everything was great, but very much there's this hint that he comes from a traumatic background, and you see his parents arguing and the kids maybe not feeling safe at home. And then him and his siblings kind of have this ritual where they jump in the water, and as long as they can, however long they can stay underwater is like their escape, right? So you very much get the impression that they have this life that they kind of want to escape from. Then we fast forward to Tom and his wife and daughters at the beach, and they actually have like a beach house. Like, this is their house, and it's on the beach. Um, and just to mention, his wife Sally is played by Blythe Danner. So Tom's mother called and says that she's coming over, and Tom just, I mean, I think he pretty much says verbatim, like, I hate her about his mom. So you very much know he's not excited about his mom coming over, and she comes over very quickly. By the way, Brandie, which I don't know if you noticed in the movie, but it's like she calls, and then literally 30 seconds later, she's already there. So that was
No
odd.
warning.
Yeah, no warning. It was like, I'm coming, and then she's at the door.
Also, one thing I want to say, like before she
Mhm.
comes over, it shows him playing with his daughters, and like one of them is sitting on his lap and he's smoking a cigarette, like right in his kids' faces. Like it took me back because the movie's 1991 and
Mhm.
way more people smoked then and smoked everywhere. And like throughout the movie, he's like a chimney all the time. But I was just laughing because nowadays, like nobody's doing that with kids in their lap. And it was funny. It showed his level of dysfunction, but also just how normalized smoking was in the 90s and 80s.
Yeah, very good to mention that this movie was made in 91. And you can certainly tell. I mean, if you go back and watch it, it's very much early 90s.
Shoulder pad orama.
Yes. Even his mom who comes over is like in a full suit, like a pencil skirt suit. Um, which is so funny because I like on a normal day, you're not gonna find me in a suit. If I'm
Me
going
neither.
if I'm coming over to your house, I'm not gonna be in a suit. Um, so his mom comes over to say that his sister tried to kill herself again and that she was in a coma when they found her, and she's referencing Savannah, who is his twin sister. And then she says, try to kill herself again, so you know that she has attempted suicide before. Um, she mentions the psychiatrist in New York because I guess that's where Savannah lives, and they found her in New York. And so the psychiatrist in New York is Dr. Susan Lowenstein. And I'm chuckling a little bit because the mom's like, this Jew psychiatrist, they have to
Yeah.
say Jew, right? Is
Yeah.
like they have to say it. And um she is basically wanting Tom to go to New York because his mom says, I won't be welcome there if I go. And um you can tell just from this scene that his mom is maybe a difficult person.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
you can tell she is really detached
yes.
from
Very detached.
everything. Yeah.
Very detached. So Tom and his mom get in this fight, and after that, Tom and his wife Sally walk on the beach, and they get into this exchange where it's very apparent he's having marital issues because she says something like, "You haven't touched me in weeks, like we're not connected." And he says he doesn't know how he feels about her. And she says, "Well, you know how you felt after Luke died, and then Luke is his older brother who died in the past." So anyways, they kind of have this little thing where they have issues. So
But
Tom
Sally is
mhm,
like her phrasing was so lovely. I'm sorry you're hurting. Tell me what you're thinking.
yeah.
She has all these invitations to him to connect, and he is not having any of it.
He's not having any of it. And she calls him pathetic at the end. She says, "You're pathetic." Because she's trying to ask him, like, how do you feel? Like, tell me anything. And he's like, "I don't know." And she's like, "You're pathetic," which I understand this sentiment that she has because she's frustrated with
Yeah.
him. Yeah. So Tom travels to New York City to see Dr. Lowenstein. And so this is the first scene where we really see the psychiatrist in the movie that we will be talking about. So he says that he's nervous to see her. And you can tell that he's nervous. He's kind of like jittery walking around, and he's almost like making jokes, like kind of making light of the situation, but it's not because he doesn't care, it's because he's just really nervous of like what to say or what to do. Um and then the psychiatrist or Dr. Lowenstein mentions that Savannah's, I can't remember if it was her who mentioned it or if it was Tom who mentioned it, but we find out her first suicide attempt was after their brother Luke died. But at that point, Tom changes the subject and he gets immediately mad at her. And he's like, I don't like psychiatrists. They don't do a fucking thing to help my sister. Like, what's the point? Right? Like, no one's been able to help her. You're not going to be able to fucking help her either. And Dr. Lowenstein says, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to help her, but I want to keep trying. And he's saying, well, what's the point in trying? So she tells him, well, it sounds like you've resigned to losing her. And he's like, I guess I have. And she says, well, you can't help me then if you've resigned to losing her. And it's at that point that he slows down a bit and he's like, okay, well, what information do you want? And she is wanting from Tom stories from their childhood to kind of like be Savannah's memory to fill in the missing details. And there's a lot to say about this scene, but something funny I mentioned, I think a lot of movies do this and I get it like for the sake of time, but these meetings are always so short.
Right.
This is like a 4-minute exchange and then she's like, "Okay, come back tomorrow." And I'm like, "Well, he's already at your office. Wouldn't you want to know some more information?" But yeah, that's the first time that we see Dr. Lowenstein, and I thought that she did a good job. Like, when she said, "Well, it sounds like you're resigned to losing her," that was the right thing to say, 'cause it
Yeah.
did sound like that.
Yeah, it sounded because he was really shut down. Like, it's clear
Yeah.
by this point in the movie that their family value is you don't talk about anything that happened in the family.
Yes.
And that's really bumping up against his sister's near death experience and her trying to get this information from him. And he's having this struggle. We don't talk about family things. I think that's apparent. Also, another very fancy psychiatry office. And I found myself wondering the whole time in the movie, how does she pay for this very expensive, fancy psychiatrist? I have no idea.
Well,
Like the financial aspect of that arrangement, because they never discuss it.
they never discuss it. You don't know how she has the apartment in New York, how she's paying this fancy pants psychiatrist, and Savannah is a poet and I guess has published some poems, but not to like knock poets, but like the impression we get is that she doesn't seem well known, or they don't make her out to be like a famous poet or something. So it is interesting, like how does she afford that? And yeah, and it's a very, very fancy office. And she's also she's dressed very fancy. She's in a suit, like has it very put together, right? I also liked when he was like, you know, shrinks can't do a fucking thing. No one can help her. Um, I liked when she said, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to be able to help her either. Like, that's very honest. It's a very honest thing to tell a family member or a client or something, that
Yeah.
you're going to do your best.
Yeah. She didn't make promises, which we would be foolish if we did that in our profession for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so it goes to um he Tom is staying at Savannah's apartment, if I'm correct in that.
Mhm.
Like that's where he's staying at her apartment while he's in New York. And just like a quick funny aside, because this character will come back later, but I guess Savannah's neighbor Eddie, who's played by George Carlin, like when Tom was in her apartment, he knocks something over and breaks it, and Eddie, I guess, hears it because he's next door. And Eddie just comes in with the gun. Like he's ready to shoot down this intruder. And Tom's like, Eddie, it's me. And I guess they know each other. I also just love George Carlin. So I had to mention his
And he
character.
also plays a gay man in this movie, which is chef's kiss. Lovely.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So next we see Tom going to the hospital where his sister is at, and he sees Savannah for the first time. And he gets really close to Savannah to talk to her. And you can tell, I mean, he's trying to be gentle with her, and he really cares about her, is what you get just from this time of him trying to get close to her. But he's also mad that she's restrained, because in the scene you see her being restrained. So he's mad about that, and he finds Dr. Lowenstein at the hospital and starts yelling at her. And he's like, I don't like it. I can't remember everything he said, but the gist was like, I don't like that you're doing this to her. And Dr. Lowenstein yells back and says, I don't care what you like. She's a harm to herself, and we had to do that. And I guess Tom felt like she was being condescending. And so then she apologizes for being condescending. But then in this scene, there's clearly some chemistry between Tom and Dr. Lowe. He almost likes that she's yelling back at him, and then he asks her to go to lunch. So that was a very funny exchange.
The chemistry piece happened really fast. Like I felt like we were missing something because they went from sort of him hating her and hating psychiatrists to now he says, let's go to lunch.
Yeah, it was very rushed. It was like,
Mhm.
wait, this one exchange is all it took for him to be. And then it's also funny because this really is such a typical like early 90s movie, because Tom, when he does flirt with her, it's laid on very thick throughout the
Very
movie.
thick.
Very, I mean, over the top. There's no way to deny that he is clearly into her. So they go to lunch, and Dr. Lowenstein asks him, why didn't your dad answer my telegram? And he says that his dad doesn't like bad news. Again, another indicator that his family does not want to talk about anything. And he says the Southern way is always to make jokes. You either avoid pain or you laugh about it, which is like essentially his mother's way. And then, Southern way is to joke about it. And then as they're walking away from lunch, she asks him to call her Susan. So it's like a little, oh, this isn't super formal. You can call me by my first name.
Which I think this may be a good point for us to talk about. If
Yeah.
this were a real situation with a real client and I did have contact with the client's permission with family
Mm.
members. That's something that, the family member would have to sign paperwork, and then at that
Yes.
point, we're doing family therapy. And in this
Mm.
arrangement that they're having, it's a very amorphous, undefined situation where he's disclosing mental health information, but they don't really have a formal relationship, which, according to today's ethics, we would definitely have to have.
For sure. It's an interesting blurred line that they're showing here because realistically, if I were Dr. Lowenstein, I would be looking at Tom as the family member of a client. And I'm really only going to talk to you as much as necessary. There would be some paperwork to sign. It would be very much in the context of family therapy. This all seems very loosey goosey. It's like your sister's in the hospital, come, let's talk. And now a day later or 2 days later, we're having lunch on the park bench, like
Right.
which is
Wouldn't happen.
very no, it's very odd. Way too informal. So after this lunch, there's a flashback to his childhood. And so in the flashback, it's him, it's Savannah and their older brother Luke, and it's his mom and dad. And his dad in the flashback is insulting his mom's food, but being very it's like disgusting behavior. I mean, really awful. And Tom tries saying like, "Well, I think the food's good." And then all of the anger is now on Tom and his father's like mocking him, hitting his face, yelling at him, like grabbing his face, and then he starts calling Tom a girl and he's telling Savannah like, "Oh, go get a dress for Tom to wear." And it's just this very like it's an awful scene. And then the mom, she goes, because that's coming about the food. She goes to give him a different plate of food and she just serves him dog food. And the kids are all seeing her put the can of dog food on the plate. And then it's hilarious because she serves him the dog food and he's like, "Now this is food, Lila. This is the good stuff," you know? But that's the first clue into the kind of environment that he grew up in.
Yeah. Also, the dog food, like, she mixes it with rice and puts Worcestershire in it and
Yeah.
onion, and she basically tells him she made him a hash.
Yeah.
But it really is like he's abusive and then she's spiteful and secretive, and it really does show their dynamic quite well.
Definitely. So back at Dr. Lowenstein's office, he's saying that his mom, Lila, is a liar. And Dr. Lowenstein says, "Well, that's interesting because Lila says the same about you, that you're a liar." And then they go back and forth where his mom has said that she encouraged Savannah to be a poet, and then Tom is saying that's not true. Mom burned her journals when we were younger because she was writing about the family. So again, you don't talk about it, you don't write about it. And Dr. Lowenstein asks Tom if he can say anything good about his parents. And he says Luke and Savannah were good, but he's always been dull and responsible. And so it's like kind of I'm curious your opinion on how you read that scene because he can't really say anything good about his parents, but he's trying to say Luke and Savannah were like good things that came from his parents, but not him.
That's how I read it too. He's really
Okay.
down on himself, which kind of goes at the beginning of the movie. We learn he's an unemployed coach and he's kind of having a midlife crisis before this whole thing starts. And he's very down on himself and has a lot of shame, you can tell.
Oh, for sure. I mean, marriage is not doing great. He's got this like unspoken trauma. His sister has tried to kill herself. And yeah, there's a lot going on. So, um, he then goes back in to see his sister and reads to her. So again, another very like loving, gentle moment that he really cares about Savannah. And then he tells this story back in the therapy office. He tells this story of when he was like 7 or 8 years old, and his mother had a baby, but the baby was still it was a stillbirth, or the baby was stillborn. And so the dad wrapped the baby up, and Savannah was in a rocking chair with the dead baby, saying to the baby, "You're the lucky one because you don't have to live with us." And he says Savannah didn't, the next day he asked Savannah about it, and she says she didn't remember. So he was her memory even back then. That was a heartbreaking story to hear, because you must really hate your childhood to say something like that to a stillborn baby
Yeah. So at 7, like they
at
were 7 when that
7.
happened. You're the lucky one because you don't have to live with us.
Yeah, very sad. So over, as the movie goes on, we get these little clue-ins to how terrible it must have been. Um, he, next he goes back to his sister's apartment, and his wife Sally calls him. And I guess he was supposed to come visit home. And Sally says, "I don't know if that's such a good idea. I don't think you should come visit home." And he says, "What's his name?" Like, without Sally even saying it, he knows there's another man. And she says, "Jack Cleveland." And I guess he knows who Jack Cleveland is. He's really pissed about it. Like, why him? Why would you pick Jack Cleveland? He calls him some insulting names. And she says, "Because he knows how he feels about me." And he asked Sally, "Are you really in love?" And she said, "I'm not sure. I could be doing this just to hurt you." Um, which, what a moment of honesty. I mean, I kind of liked how she said that, where it's like, is this love or is this spite? I
Her
don't know
character
yet.
is really pure and honest and lovely.
Amazing. I mean, amazing. And then he starts writing down, I think he's writing, I can't tell if this is just him narrating or if he plans to say this, but essentially you hear him narrating that, "I don't know what keeps me at such a distance from you. I'm sorry I've disappointed you. I wish saying I love you wasn't so hard, and I miss you, and I miss touching you." So there's this, it's like he has this inner conflict of, he keeps her at bay, but he really loves her and misses her. He doesn't know why he can't let himself be close to her.
It's making me wonder about, so Pat Conroy wrote this book. It came out in 1986, and it was written as fiction, but really largely based on his actual childhood. And so I wonder if his portrayal of the wife in the movie is how he feels about his wife in real life. And I
Mm.
was wondering about the correlation because he really does write her to be sort of this, even though she had an affair, is he writes her as kind of a flawless character in a lot of ways and able to fully articulate herself. I think that's an interesting
Yeah.
part of the storyline.
Yeah, for sure. And he, like, I'm going back maybe a little bit because I can't remember exactly at what part of the movie this comes up, but there is a part where Tom is kind of talking to himself, and he's like saying, "I've been able to keep all this in. I'm able to keep secrets better than women are, and I can hold on to it." He's like, "Until I met Dr. Lowenstein, I can't keep
Yeah.
it in anymore." And so it just very much speaks to what a therapeutic relationship can do. I mean, you can keep things in, and then you get into this space and you start opening up, and it's kind of awful at first. Like, if you're really talking about trauma for the first time, like, there's a reason people don't want to do that, you know?
Yeah. But also, shame can't live in the light. So
Yeah.
even just saying things one time to somebody or writing it to yourself and sitting with it, even just that can be really therapeutic because shame can only live in the dark and in the secrets.
And he has a lot of shame. This man has a lot. So then we get to another flashback of when Tom was a kid. And in this flashback, he goes into his mom's room, and she says she loves him and hugs him. And she tells him, "You're the only Wingo who is going to amount to something. Like, your siblings aren't as smart as you." And then his mother says something like, "I'm an amazing woman. Like, wouldn't you agree?" So that was really weird. Um, And then she tells Tom, I love you more than I love the others. You're my favorite. I can't help it. That's our little secret. Again, another secret. And she won't let him leave until he says that he loves her back. She's like, I love you. And he's like, okay, bye. Well, aren't you going to say it too? So he has to say it. And then he says it took him 20 years to tell his siblings. And then when he tells them, they all like start laughing because the mom has said the same things to them. She told them
Which
all the
is
same story.
really fucked up and manipulative and coercive and bizarre and terrible.
And it was a way to get them all on her side. It's like, you're the favorite, so do what I want. And she got all three of them to like think that. So it's very, you know, extremely fucked up. So that was an interesting flashback. And Dr. Lowenstein asks him, because I should mention when we get the flashback, it's in the context of him telling this to Dr. Lowenstein. So we're back in her office. And Dr. Lowenstein asks him, why did you tell me this story? And he says, well, I'm telling you to show you why Savannah doesn't trust mom. And she says, well, you're trying to tell me why you don't trust your mom. Then he gets mad at this. I mean, he kind of explodes. And then she's like, what? She says, what's bothering you? And that's when he says, my wife is having an affair. I never knew what was going on. And Dr. Lowenstein says, maybe you weren't paying attention. And it's at
Which,
this point I mentioned him going on the rant of like, I've been able to keep secrets better than women. Mm-hmm.
which also is for sure at this point that she is doing therapy with him with no
Yes.
formal arrangements or confidentiality discussion or any of those things that are really an important part of a therapeutic relationship.
Yes. And so that little, question of like, what is his role? Like, is he just filling in the gaps for Savannah? There's no way that you could just be filling in the gaps. Like, it's clearly therapy at this point. And it's funny. I'm going to read this verbatim because this part of the movie made me laugh when he's like, uh, he's talking about his wife having an affair and feeling betrayed. And Dr. Lowenstein says, she questions, your mother betrayed you? And he goes, I was talking about my wife. He's like, I hate this Freudian shit. And he storms out and, I'm not getting therapy anyways. And then when he's by himself back in his sister's apartment, that's when he says, I'm better than women at keeping secrets until Susan Lowenstein came along. Her questions make me as dizzy as her perfume.
There were some really cheesy lines in this movie, and a lot of them were his internal dialogue too.
The dizzy as her perfume was like one of the cheesiest ones. It had to have been for me to write it verbatim because I was like, whoa, that's a lot. Um, anyways, going forward, so they kind of leave on this really intense, tumultuous note, right? Because he storms out of our office. And then the next thing we see, he's at Eddie's apartment, who, again, Eddie is Savannah's neighbor. So he's at a party that Eddie is throwing, and Dr. Lowenstein is there. And they might have mentioned it in the beginning of the movie, and I might have forgot to say it. Eddie is friends with Susan Lowenstein, and so he referred Savannah to Susan. So he's at this party. Susan's at the party. And they're flirting, and again, he's laying it on really thick. He's like, "You look mighty pretty tonight. Like, you should dance with me." And um, he tells her, he goes, "You pissed me off, but you got me thinking about some things." And she says, "Be careful, or I'll have to start charging you." Which I'm like, "Why are you not charging him now already? Because
Right.
he's clearly a client of yours." It's just again very blurred line.
Well, they give the impression that he's going every day to her office.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't say the days of the week, but he's been there for multiple weeks, and they give the impression that he's going daily to talk to her.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I don't see clients daily for free, so it is weird.
No.
It's a little bit of a hole, a plot hole. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. And then it's at this point that we find out that Dr. Lowenstein is married, but her husband's not there. He travels a lot for work. And then Tom walks her home, and you find out, like, on their walk, that her husband is a musician named Herbert Woodruff, who she fell in love with when she was 22. And you kind of find out she doesn't have a great marriage either, right? She doesn't want to go into the details. She doesn't want to divulge any information for him, but that's the impression you get. And then he says, he goes, "You have a great smile. You should smile more." And I was thinking, well, if that's not the perfect recipe for me to want to slap him in the face.
Right. But also in the 90s, people like even now, I think men still say that to women, but there's been more pushback and that's less normalized. But
Yeah.
in 1991, I guarantee you that was on the regular if a woman wasn't looking perky. I would like to point out he keeps telling her in the scene how beautiful she is, and she is wearing white pantyhose and a
Yes.
white suit with shoulder pads. Like when they first pan out and show her whole self, I was like, wow, white pantyhose. We haven't seen those in a bit. And then I realized I started paying attention. She is dressed monochromatically in every scene of the movie,
Yes.
and so is his wife. Like the women's outfits are all
Oh,
monochromatic in the whole movie.
interesting. Interesting. What do you think the meaning is of that? Because that seems purposeful, like as far as the wardrobe department of this movie.
I don't know. I kept wondering about that myself. Because it's sort of like it made them more sort of blending in, I think, as opposed to standing out, or it was really interesting. I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot and I haven't come up with a reason. So if you're listening to this and you have thoughts, post them on our Instagram or send us a message because I'm really curious about that too. Clearly it was on purpose, but
And
anyway,
maybe
I did want to
it's
point out the white pantyhose because that was just too much.
that is interesting. And maybe it's because, my off the top of my head theory is like he has this not great relationship with his mother, and maybe all the women like being dressed all one color is kind of a sign of like all women are the same, you know? Like
Oh
he
yeah,
doesn't
maybe.
yeah, he doesn't really trust women. And so yeah, maybe there's something there. Interesting
Because
observation.
his mom also is wearing monochromatic in every scene.
Yeah. Gosh, now that you say that, I'm looking back and I'm like, how did I miss that when I was watching this? But you're right, it's absolutely true.
I've also seen this movie like probably 10 times. So
Well, there you go. So they after this, yeah, he's telling her how beautiful she is. Um and she's trying to like kind of push him off of her. She's like, "Gosh, how hard is it to get a cab in the city?" And she's looking for a cab. And he gets a cab for her, but he goes with her, which I thought was interesting because I thought they were going more towards like she wanted to go home, but he went with her. So, anyways, he goes home with her and he goes up to her place, and he meets her son Bernard, who's played by Jason Gould, which is Barbra Streisand's son in real life. Did you know that? Okay, I didn't know that until I looked this up and I was like, "Oh." So, and then he says something like, "Dad called from Vienna to say hi," and it's indicative of like dad's never there. Also interesting, Bernard is a teenager, but he looks much older. Like I think he's 25 in this movie and he definitely looks 25. So when he's like supposed to be in high school, I thought that was funny. But anyways, Bernard is like typical teenager and is kind of rude to them, and so they walk out, and she asks Tom to coach her son for football. And because I guess he wants to play football, he needs a coach. And Tom says, I think she tries asking Tom, like, how much do you charge? And he goes, well, how much do you charge? She says, well, I charge 150 an hour. And he goes, okay, I'll take that. Sounds like a deal to me. And this is also another, like, from a therapist perspective, it's very blurred, inappropriate lines, like he's a client, but his sister's also a client, but now he's going to be providing a service to coach her son, and she's now going to be paying him.
yeah, they've now entered into a dual relationship situation. So there's no ethical boundaries. Now they're in a dual relationship. It's very inappropriate.
extremely inappropriate.
Your
But they
counselor should never offer to hire you for any purpose at all.
no,
Ever.
no,
No.
you don't provide services to them. So that one is yeah, that was kind of a wild scene. So he's back in his sister's apartment and he sees poems from someone named Renata Halpert. And I'm maybe already giving a spoiler to the movie here, but that's his sister. It's just another name that she went by, and he finds out later, and like we'll get to it. But he finds these poems, and now he's back in Dr. Lowenstein's office, which he really is there like every day. It's very excessive. And she mentions that she's proud of the work they're doing, and he throws a foot he throws a football to her in the office, and I'm like, what's happening here? Like, are we in a therapy session? Are we like, what's going on? So they go there, and he goes back to the sister's apartment, and that's when he finds out Renata is his sister, and Dr. Lowenstein must have known. And so he storms in Dr. Lowenstein's office and is like really pissed off that she would know about this. And she says, I think Dr. Lowenstein's was saying that Savannah being under this name, Renata Halpern, uh that person is a Jewish child of survivors of the Holocaust, is like this like identity that she's created that's writing these poems. And so Dr. Lowenstein starts asking, why would Savannah pretend to be a Jewish child of survivors of the Holocaust? What is she surviving? And so they get into this big argument, and she says that Tom is avoiding and complaining and pointing the finger. And he tells her, he's like, so this is what people pay you for, to turn them into someone else? And she fights back and says, your reaction makes me sick. And then a very shocking scene, she throws a book at his face, and
Right.
his nose is bleeding. And he's like leaned back in this chair, and there's just so much blood on his face. And she goes into she has like a little freezer or something in her office, and she's getting him ice. And he starts laughing, and he says, oh, there's a big malpractice suit coming out of this, doctor. And then they just start laughing about it. And then they go to a French restaurant for dinner.
Right? Yes, it's
I
a
was
very
like,
surprising scene. And also, your therapist should never be throwing things at your face. And um, yeah, that not only they go to a very fancy dinner, she orders in French. He's telling her women ordering in French is sexy. Could she read the whole menu? I mean,
Mhm.
there is no there's no boundary.
No boundary at all. And also going back to the scene when she throws the book at his face. I mean, obviously you would never want to do that. Um, and like it really would be a malpractice suit if you like broke your client's nose by throwing something at them.
Right.
Like that would be crazy. But something I will say to anyone listening, that as a therapist, I don't argue with clients. Like if I have a client who's yelling at me and berating me, and they're wanting to kind of rise a fight out of me, I don't get into that dynamic with them. That's not at all. I wouldn't be like, you make me sick and you do. It's like, no.
Right.
Not at all. It would be like, let's take a moment and we can get back to, like, if you're angry, that's fine, but we can discuss it in a healthy way. I'm not going to get into an argument with you. So we either need to end this conversation, or, I mean, honestly, I don't want to be spoken to abusively by a client. So that honestly could be grounds of you terminating that relationship, because, like, I don't have to put up with that.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I
I
just
don't
thought
get
I
into
would mention that.
arguments either.
Oh,
Our job is to join with a client
yes.
and go from there. And also, if I felt that coming up for me, that's a sign for me that I'm not a good fit for that client. And
Yeah.
so it's incumbent on us as therapists to see that and refer out and not stay in those negative relationships with clients.
Yeah, because when something like this happens, that should have been the end of the therapeutic relationship, but it's very much not. I mean, this movie doesn't make any sense because now they're at dinner and then they go back and like therapy continues. So Anyways, yeah, they go to the French restaurant, and um he tells her that he had a dream about her last night. And again, this is another scene where he's laying it on super thick with her, like you said. And she asked about the dream, and he says the dream is that there was like a blinding snowstorm, and he went outside and saw her in the snowstorm, and then they left together and they were slow dancing in the rainbow room. And then they try to like interpret what the dream would have meant. And she says something like, "Oh, there was a blinding snowstorm in your dream. Maybe there's something you don't want to see or you're not ready to see because you can't really like see in a snowstorm." So next, he is coaching Bernard, which these scenes are so funny because he's like throwing the ball with Bernard, and at times he's getting tackled by Bernard. And she comes to meet them. She comes with food, and she asks him what he thinks of her. And he gives her a compliment at first, and she says, "No, what do you really think?" And he says, "Well, I think you're a really sad woman," which is true. And she says that this is the first friend she's made in a long time. And he says, "Let's go to the movies." And they go, and they don't go to the actual movies. They go back to watch like home videos that Tom found in Savannah's apartment. But something that was so funny about this scene is that they leave Bernard behind. Like they're in this field, they're in this field. He's coaching Bernard. Bernard is there with the sandwich that she brought. And then they just go off and watch a movie. I was like, okay, forget him. Um, so as they're watching the home movies, he starts explaining that their father always lost money, and he kind of always had these like really bizarre ideas of ways to make money, but they never really worked. And then she asks about Luke's death, and you find out that, well, I kind of want to hear how you took this scene, Brandie, because they give some information, but they don't give like a ton of information. But basically, he got this land. There's like this area of land that his dad didn't want, so Luke got the land. But then I guess the dad sold it to the government, and they were going to put some power plant on the land. Well, in rebellion, Luke blew up the power plant. And so the government kind of backed off. But then Tom says Luke went on his own private war. He hurt people. Him and Savannah tried to stop him, but the government did and put a bullet in his head. And as he's telling this story, he tells this really traumatic story of how he lost his brother. He's like, "Yeah, he got a bullet in his head. Well, do you want something to drink? Let me get us a drink." He's just so cut off, detached.
Yes.
And Dr. Lowenstein says, "You've never cried about him, have you?" And he's like, "Well, tears won't bring him back." And she says, "But it might bring you back," which I thought was really powerful.
Totally. And also not appropriate for his living room. Like,
No, not at all. They should not be in his living room watching home movies for this conversation. And then he does end up sobbing, crying there. And there was a point too, which I thought was weird. Like when he tells the story about Luke, because like imagine Dr. Lowenstein sitting on a couch, the TV's in front of them. He's kind of leaned up like near the TV. He starts telling the story about Luke. He goes to sit next to her on the couch. So they're very close, like too close. And as he's telling this story, she starts holding his hand. I don't know if you noticed that, but she like kind of like rubs his arm and then goes down to like hold his hand. And then he's crying, and then like she hugs him on the couch, which I was like, even in a therapy office, that would be way too close and intimate. I don't,
yeah, he
that was
had his
weird.
head on her bosom. Like she was
Yes.
holding him to her bosom.
Yeah. Very interesting. So way too intimate, super inappropriate. But another clue in that he has been detached from his life story for very long. The next thing we see, he goes back home to see his wife, Sally, and she tells him that she goes, "Jack wants to marry me." And funnily enough, he goes, "Well, do you need a letter of recommendation?" But in all seriousness, he asks her what she wants, and she doesn't really seem to know, and he apologizes and he understands why she's in this dilemma and kind of what his role is in it. And she asks him if he's gonna sleep in the room, and he says it would be too confusing. And so he sleeps on the couch. The next day, the oldest daughter asks them if they're in a if like mom and dad are in a fight. And he tries to play it off, and his daughter was like, "Don't fool me."
Mm,
Which is very I like that they included that scene because kids always know.
for sure.
Yeah, kids always know, which is kind of like going back to his childhood. They knew from a very young age things were not right. So there's a flashback that goes to it's the kids' birthdays. Maybe it's him and his sister's birthday. I can't recall, but their dad doesn't want to celebrate. He just wants to watch TV, and the mom turns off the TV. She's like, "No, we need to celebrate the kid's birthday." And the dad gets physical with their mom. He's physically hurting her. The kids are screaming. And then you see the TV kind of explode. And then it flashes to Luke, who has a gun, and he shot the TV. And he calls our dad a son of a bitch. And then it flashes forward to Tom and his 3 daughters are on this boat with his dad named Henry. And so you get to this is like the first time we're seeing his father in real time. Yeah, but, like, Luke seems to be kind of the I don't wanna say strong because I don't wanna say, like, everyone else was weak, but Luke was not afraid to stand up to their dad.
Yeah, I think they wrote him as a typical oldest male child protector.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep, definitely, and he really looked up to Luke. He kind of, I think, admired Luke for just who he was. So on the boat, on the shrimp boat, Tom is telling his dad, he says, "The girls really love you." And his dad just says, "I know." And then he moves on to like talking about the Dodgers game. And Tom smiles because he knows like where he learned to be detached was from his dad. And his mom too, but I guess at that point in time he knew it wasn't going to be a very intimate conversation. It was just, I know, moving on, no vulnerability,
Right.
right? Um, and then we see him talking with his mom, and he says, "I'm going to tell Dr. Lowenstein about Callenwold," which at this point in time, we don't know what that is in the movie. But she gets upset and she's like, "We agreed to keep that private." And he says, "Well, that was a promise we made as kids. I'm not going to do that anymore." And she tries saying that he's being cruel because I think he then starts asking something about Luke because she says, "You're so cruel." And he kind of just reminds her that they can bring up the past, and to be patient with him. So at this next point, this is the scene that I gave a trigger warning for. And in the movie, they do show flashbacks, which was really intense to see. But he's back in Dr. Lowenstein's office, and he just tells this story of him and his siblings. Him and Savannah were 13, and so I'm not sure how Luke was, but he's older than them. And these 3 men broke into their house and they raped his mom and Savannah. And then we find out Callenwold is a prison that they escaped from. So these 3 men break in. It's very terrifying. The mom is calling for Tom because their dad wasn't there. The mom is calling for Tom, which holy shit. I mean, to be 13 and like they're calling for you to help when these 3 like huge men are breaking in the house. And so he says, "Yeah, they raped my mom and Savannah." Dr. Lowenstein's asking him, "Well, what were you doing while this was happening?" And he's like, "I don't know." She goes, "Well, did you run and ask for help?" He's like, "I don't really remember," and giving very evasive answers. And then it clicks with Dr. Lowenstein, like, oh, you said there was 3 men who broke into the house. So these other 2 men are assaulting your mom and sister. Where was the 3rd man? And he does not want to say it. But then we find out the 3rd man raped him. And he says, I didn't know that could happen to boys. And then in the flashback, um, Luke is outside and he's looking through the window, and he goes and gets a gun and he shoots the 2 men that have raped his mom in Savannah, and then his mom kills the guy that raped him. She comes from behind and stabs him, I believe. And they never told anyone. Like, they didn't even tell their dad. They buried the bodies, never told authorities, never told their dad. They clean up the whole house. Then the dad comes home for dinner and they just sit there and have dinner. And he said the silence was worse than the rapes. And he said Savannah did what she was told. She pretended like nothing happened. But while they're at dinner, her dress is on inside out because she's just so dissociated. She doesn't really know what's happening. She's not in her body. And then 3 days later was her first suicide attempt. And then as soon as he tells that story, she's like, "Well, how do you feel?" He's like, "Oh, I feel fine." And he learns to cover his pain, and it's a really sad moment, but you very much, it's like the moment in the movie where you finally find out this is their whole life was traumatic, but this was like the ultimate
Yeah. And the way
incident.
he's I do think Nick Nolte's acting in this movie is really good.
Yeah.
And he actually won a Golden Globe for Best Actor and was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor for this
Oh,
role.
wow.
And the way he tells the story, you can tell he does start sounding more childlike. And Lowenstein even says at one point that's a child's answer when she asks him a question. And
Yeah.
his way that he acted this was phenomenal.
It was excellent, and she was like, her as the therapist in this moment handled it really well. I have to correct myself. I thought when he was sobbing on the couch was when they were watching the home movies. Now I'm looking at my notes. It's in her office when he starts sobbing. I think I got those mixed up.
I was wondering about that
Yeah.
because I remembered it being after this scene too. Yeah.
Yeah, so apologies. I got those mixed up. This is where, like, back when they were watching the home videos, he's still kind of cut off, like telling jokes. This is where she says, "You really learn to cover your pain." And this is when he starts sobbing, and she holds his hand and hugs him.
To her
Uh,
bosom.
yes, aside from that part where he's just like in her chest, and he's crying on her. Aside from that, this was a really good scene as far as like therapy goes, because she's asking the right questions. She's being very like kind of soft and patient with him, and she's
Mm.
kind of like, she can tell there's something here. And even when she realizes why he's not wanting to say what he was doing at the time, even when she realizes it, she doesn't like come out and say, "Oh, well, the 3rd man must have done something to you." She doesn't like insinuate anything. She just says, "What was the 3rd man doing?" And it kind of, it opens up the door for him to like say it. Um, and she's tearing up during this scene,
Mhm.
which I liked seeing, because I think, I know as therapists, for a long time, I thought how can I say this? Like, we don't ever want to cry so much that now it's about us. But like, I
Mm.
also think it's okay if a client is telling a story and we're tearing up because we care about this person and we're hearing this absolutely awful thing that happened to them. Like, the therapist has emotions too. Hearing the story, which I thought was nice to see.
Yeah, I made a note about that also, and I've cried during sessions with clients. Like you said,
Mhm.
not like boohooing, but definitely gotten teary. And I've experienced that with my own counselor. And it actually was extremely validating because I was like, well, shit, if she's crying, like, no wonder I feel so much pain about this. It I think can be very validating. And I think to your point, like I sort of left grad school feeling a little scrubbed of my humanity in some ways.
Mhm.
I think sometimes our training can do that. And then I had to figure out how to put myself back into my counseling and be able to show my not just my quirky side, but just myself as a full human. And I loved that they showed her having tears in her face, and it was well acted, totally believable. I probably would have been crying if I were the counselor in that situation too. It was a terrible story to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And validating is a good way to put it because it lets the client know, like, this is a big deal. I mean,
Yeah.
this is such a huge deal. So, after that scene, we see him coaching Bernard again, and Bernard's dad comes, who is Dr. Lowenstein's husband. And so this is the first time we're seeing Dr. Lowenstein's husband, and he invites Tom to a dinner party that him and Susan are hosting. Um, he then goes and sees Savannah at the hospital, and she's doing okay. This is the first time where she's awake and coherent, and they're talking, and um she apologizes for all that she's put Tom through, and he says, "No, actually, you did me a favor." So it's like this moment of, "Hey, you got to talk about the thing that you've been hiding for so long. Look at what a moment of healing this is for both of you as siblings." So it was really nice. And they go forward to this dinner party, and Susan's husband plays the violin. I know I said he was a musician earlier, but he's a violinist, and
He's like if
uh
they give the impression he is a very fancy, well-known,
world renowned,
world-renowned.
yes.
He's playing a Stradivarius.
Yes, absolutely. And while he's playing, he has a pianist with him, and Tom is standing extremely close to Dr.
Extremely.
Like he is on top of her. And I'm like, you are at a party her husband is throwing. That seems a little inappropriate. So he's extremely close to her. And she tells him, I think my husband's having an affair with the pianist. And it's like, oh. And the like earlier in the movie, Bernard does tell him like, "Oh, my father doesn't like you." He says that to Tom, which you can like assume why. Not only is Tom getting close to Dr. Lowenstein, I think the dislike is more out of he's this like fancy pants famous violinist, and Tom is southern and a football coach and lower class, and so at the party her husband really makes an ass out of himself and tells Tom to go fetch him a scotch and soda, and is also being like once they all sit down for dinner, um
Which is the most pretentious looking dinner party
I
ever.
mean, seriously, it looks like a terrible time. It's not a dinner I would want to be invited to. Everyone there just kind of looks like an asshole.
Yeah,
Like,
seriously. Yeah.
honestly, it's like, it's ridiculous. So they're at dinner, and Dr. Lowenstein's husband mentions to everyone at dinner that Savannah is a patient of Susan's. And so it's another ethical violation. It's like, why would he know your patients' names? And then it's also weird because Tom, who is Savannah's sister, is at the dinner table, and now everyone knows that his sister's a psych patient. And
And they know some of them have heard of her because of her poetry.
yeah,
So now everybody at the table is aware of who this person is and that she is seeing Dr. Lowenstein and that Tom is his sister. I mean, his brother, her brother.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It just completely inappropriate. And then he starts picking on Tom, and he's mad that Susan has Bernard playing football because Bernard also plays the violin, and he's thinking like, he's playing football, his hands could get hurt. And it's kind of clear in that moment that the only reason Susan wanted Bernard to play was like pushing. I shouldn't say pushing because Bernard wants to play football, but the only reason she encouraged him is because she doesn't really give a fuck about the violin career. It's almost like out of spite of her husband. So he's like mad about that. And then Dr. Lowenstein at the table calls out the pianist, and she's like, "Well, everyone here knows you're fucking my husband, but no one's saying anything about it." I mean, just lays it all out there. And so it gets really ugly. And then Tom gets his fiddle and puts it over the balcony and is like threatening, like, "I'm gonna throw your instrument over the balcony if you don't apologize to Susan." And he like, and then I guess this fiddle is like worth $1 million or something
It's
fucking
a
ridiculous. I'm like,
it's a violin. He calls it a
violin.
fiddle because
Yeah.
he's playing sort of the dumb southerner role. But yeah, it's a
Yeah.
Stradivarius like $1 million violin, and he's
Yeah.
holding it over the high rise.
And I just thought fiddle was so funny. So and I also like her husband's also such an ass. And I'm like, oh yeah, your fiddle's worth $1 million. Right. So he puts the fiddle over the balcony and like throws it up in the air, and like they all scream, and he catches it. And so he apologizes to Susan. And then he also demands an apology for himself, which he gets because he doesn't want his precious $1 million like going out the window. So he leaves, she chases him, and he says, now I know why you always seem so sad. And she goes, "Take me with you." And here's where they go. I can't tell like if they're in Savannah's apartment or did they get a hotel or something. Do you
I
know
think
where
they're
they
in
were at?
Savannah's apartment.
Okay. They're in Savannah's apartment, and obviously they have sex, and but it's like a very weird, like the way the scene starts is he's he is behind her, but they're facing the same way. Like it's almost like he's hugging her and caressing her from behind, like kissing her from behind.
But she's
Um
like pressed up against the wall. It is
yes.
weird. For the first
Yes.
time, they're showing them being sexually intimate, that they're not facing each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And it almost was a sign of like, would it be too intimate to start looking at each other because you still are, I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. But it was weird. It kind of seemed like he was humping her a little bit, like kind of like going up and down, like as he's behind her. And then she turns to him, they have sex. And then he says something like, "I'm starting to like adultery." Which I was
Yeah,
like, "Okay,
right.
you did not need to say that, but okay." Yeah, hilarious, hilarious. And then the next morning, like, Eddie comes up because Eddie's the neighbor, he comes over and he has food, and he's like, "Well, I'm just glad y'all both got laid." So he's just kinda blasé about it. Um, and, it really just I mean, you see these, like, scenes where they're, like, on the countryside, and they're really in love, and, she's afraid of what will happen when Sally wants you back, and he goes, "Well, what makes you think that Sally would want me back?" She says, "Because I've tried the merchandise." And I'm like, "Oh God." It
Then
was
she
like,
sucks on his nipple.
yes.
And I was just thinking, that's really Barbara Streisand sucking on Nick Nolte's nipple. And how, like, I I mean, I guess they agreed to that, but they could have really done anything else in that moment other than that. It was very bizarre.
It was, gross. I had, like, a visceral reaction. I was like, "Ew, I don't know if I wanted to see that." And then, um, he's and so, like, now they're back in New York, and Tom's taking a walk with Savannah, his sister, and he says, "I might stay in New York." And then Sally calls him. His wife Sally calls him, and nothing is said, but they do a good job of letting you know, like, Sally is calling because she wants him back. And then so it goes forward to him, and he's across the street, Like Dr. Lowenstein walks out of this building and he's across the street and she sees him and they both look kind of upset. And then when they get closer, she says, she called you. Yep. And she's like, we knew this day would come. And then Savannah, going
But
forward a
wait,
little
when
bit.
she says that and then they hug and she drops her files all over the streets of New York,
Oh, yes. I forgot
which
about that part.
probably contain private information about clients, one would assume. Maybe not, but yeah.
But
I was like, what
probably.
about your papers?
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's just too busy hugging him and we knew this day would come and then it goes forward to, he's back at Savannah's and Savannah's there. And she says that she wrote a book of poems called Prince of Tides and she made it out to Tom, her memory, which was really, really sweet. Um And then the last scene is, of course, him and Dr. Lowenstein dancing in the Rainbow Room, going back to that dream he expressed at the French restaurant. And then it's him narrating. It goes back to him like on the beach with his family at their house, and he goes, like him narrating, he says, I can now give back to the women in my life thanks to her. He returned to his southern home in his life as a teacher and a coach. And then the very end of the movie, he's driving and he's on this bridge and he says that every time he gets to the top of the bridge, he always says the same thing. Lowenstein. Lowenstein. Which I that was very cheesy. And that's how the movie ends. I wanted to ask your opinion on this, but I wrote in my notes, I said, would Susan feel used? I would feel used if it was like, not that she's a void of fault here, because she should not have had this inappropriate relationship with him. But like, she helps him with therapy. She helps him like heal. She helps him like fall back in love. She falls in love with him. And then he's kind of like, now I can finally give back to my wife. And I was like, I don't really know how I feel about that.
Yeah, I think it's murky, right? And there's one point when she says to him, "You love her more than me," and he says, "No, just longer."
Yeah.
And then towards the end, he also says something like he wishes he could have two lives, or like a man wishes
Mhm.
he could have two lives, or something like that. And
Yeah.
um, one part of him wants to be with Lowenstein, and one part wants to be with his wife and kids, and yeah, it did.
Mhm.
I don't think she has any right to feel used,
Yeah.
but it would be sad. And I think it would be hard to know what to do with that sadness. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. Maybe there need to be a sequel about Lowenstein and what happens to her.
I mean, there really could be one. So, yeah. Anything else you want to add about this movie? I mean, there was a lot to this one.
Well, I got curious as we were watching because I know, ethics have been developed over the years of our field, sometimes because of things that happen that cause harm. And then we've realized as a profession that, well, maybe we need rules around this. So I was wondering, because I think she's a psychiatrist, is what they imply, and they use Dr. Lowenstein.
Hmm.
Um, Not that therapists can't also have doctorates, but generally it would be a safe assumption she's a psychiatrist. So I
Yeah.
was wondering, when did they make the rule that psychiatrists couldn't fuck their patients? And it was actually 1989. So this book was written in 1986
Hmm.
and the movie came out in 91, but there was not a rule about psychiatrists not having sexual relations with their patients until 1989. So I thought that was interesting. And then I went down sort of a rabbit hole of men in our field who are like a lot of them considered like the grandfathers of modern psychology that most people have heard of, like Jung and Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls and Milton Erickson.
Hmm.
And they all had fucked their clients or patients at some point. And that's not just hearsay, that you can read about that in journals and things. So clearly these ethical guidelines were needed and came about probably because of all the harm that was caused. Because inherently there's a power dynamic. Like people come to us because they think we're the experts,
Yeah.
which gives us more power in that relationship. And so it's really unethical for us to have any kind of sexual contact with patients. And I'm glad that now it's against the rules. It's also the number two reason why therapists lose their license, even
Hmm.
though I don't really find it hard to not fuck my clients. But the number one
I
reason, right? It's not that difficult.
I've never struggled with that because I view them as the client who needs help. I mean, I just don't that's not I don't know. I've never had that issue and I never will. To be honest, I never will.
I don't think so either. I'm, to be fair, I do all telehealth now, so that adds a layer of protection against that. But even when I was in person, it seems just so out of bounds. I don't understand people who cross that line. Just today, I heard about two different therapists who lost their license from fucking a client. Or there is a, like for LPCs, I think in Texas, if someone hasn't been your client for 5 years, I think is the rule
Mhm.
that you could have
Mhm.
a romantic relationship with them, or maybe it's
Yeah.
3 years. But even then, I just think it's inappropriate. But I think our field has a long history of those things happening. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it makes me want to look into what made them finally have that as a rule that you can't. Like
I'm
I
sure
wonder
there
how
was a
that came to
case.
be. Huh?
I'm sure somebody sued or there was, you
I'm
know,
sure there was something that had some negative impact happen and they were like, "Well, maybe we should clean this up a bit and,
yeah.
have
And I
something in
think
place."
I did mention men, men in our profession, but certainly there are a lot of women in our profession who have also done the same thing and lost their licenses. So I don't want to make this out to be a sexist issue at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Whew. Well, that was a good one to talk
It sure
about.
was.
It
If
sure
you
was.
liked if you liked the synopsis and you haven't seen it, it's a good movie. The book is great, and Pat Conroy also wrote a book called The Great Santini, which is also excellent.
Okay. Great. Well, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Therapy Gone Wrong, please like, review, subscribe, and follow us where you listen to your podcasts. In our next episode, we will discuss the movie Analyze This, which you can stream on Apple TV or Prime Video. If you'd like Real Therapy Gone Right, we are two actual therapists who help clients on a daily basis. Contact us if you'd like to learn more about our work or want to hire us. And you can find Lyndsey at relationshipmatterstx.com or Brandie at sellerscounseling.com. Our show email is realtherapygonewrong@gmail.com, and that's real, REEL. If you're making a movie or TV show and do not want to find your show on our podcast, we are available to consult on your projects. Get in touch. All right, bye.
Bye.